Chapter 22: Collapse of Fear Systems. For thousands of years, human civilization had quietly depended on powerful Pespa's invisible structure, a system built on fear, not always obvious, not always intentional, but deeply embedded in the way societies organize power. Fear motivated armies. Fear stabilized governments. Fear drove markets, media, and institutions to compete relentlessly for survival. It had shaped much of human history. But now something unprecedented was happening. The system was beginning to break down. When fear stops working, the collapse did not occur through revolution. There was no single uprising, no dramatic overthrow of global institutions. Instead, something subtler unfolded. Fear began losing its effectiveness as a tool of control. The leaders who attempted to manipulate populations through alarm and hostility found their influence weakening. People still listened, but they no longer reacted with the same automatic panic. The human consciousness network has changed the emotional landscape of the species. When fear messages spread, they encountered something new: empathy. And empathy disrupted the cycle. The emotional immune system. Researchers studying global patterns of consciousness noticed that humanity's emotional immune system was becoming stronger. When fear surged, communities quickly responded with calming influence. Information networks began prioritizing solutions instead of outrage. Public discussions shifted gradually toward cooperation rather than confrontation. None of this was perfectly organized. It was messy, human, but the overall trend was unmistakable. Fear still existed, yet it no longer dominated the collective mind. The data confirms the shift. In her research center, Dr. Ariana Vale examined the latest models of emotional synchronization. For centuries, fear-based messaging has reliably triggered massive emotional cascades across populations. Now the pattern has changed. Fear spikes appeared, but they decayed rapidly. Moments of compassion replaced them much faster than before. The graphs looked almost biological, as if the species had developed a psychological immune response to manipulation. Ariana shared her conclusion with Dr. Kato Nakamura. "I think we have crossed another threshold," she said. Kato studied the data carefully. "The collapse of fear systems," he replied quietly. "Technology aligns with compassion." Meanwhile, Mateo Alvarez's cooperative A networks had begun adjusting their algorithms. Early versions had focused on helping humans solve problems efficiently. Now the systems were learning something deeper. Communities achieved the most sustainable outcomes when decisions were guided by shared empathy. The AI began recommending policies and strategies that strengthened trust between groups. Over time, these suggestions reduced the effectiveness of fear-driven politics and media manipulation. Not through censorship, through better alternatives. When people experienced cooperation working in real life, fear-based narratives simply lost credibility. The city's change across the expanding network of cooperative cities, Cassandra Ruiz observed a remarkable transformation. Urban communities, once divided by intense competition, were slowly reorganizing around collaboration. Neighborhood councils, citizen science programs, shared resource networks. People began participating more actively in shaping their environments. And with participation came something powerful: ownership. When individuals felt responsible for their communities, fear-based leadership strategies no longer worked. People were less easily manipulated. The Council of Dominion watches far away in their hidden nexus. The Council of Dominion analyzed the new data from Earth with increasing concern. The models were clear. Fear amplification was no longer destabilizing the human consciousness field. Instead, the species was adapting to it. Each manipulation attempt strengthened the resilience of the love ripple. One council member spoke with growing frustration. "The species is neutralizing fear propagation." Another responded coldly. "Impossible. Fear is the oldest control mechanism in conscious systems." Yet the projections continued showing the same outcome. Humanity was evolving beyond it. The sorceress observes the turning point. From her distant vantage beyond the galaxies, the sorceress eternal recognized the moment immediately. Every awakened civilization eventually reached this stage. The collapse of fear-based control structures. Not because fear vanished, but because enough individuals learned to recognize it. Once people could see fear manipulation clearly, it lost its power. The omnipresence spoke gently within her awareness. Fear depends on unconsciousness. The sorceress finished the thought, and awareness dissolves it. Humanity's cultural shift on Earth, the transformation appeared gradually, but its effects were profound. Education systems began emphasizing emotional intelligence. Media platforms experimented with promoting cooperative dialogue. Scientific collaboration expanded across political and cultural boundaries. Young generations grew up in a world where global cooperation felt normal, not naive, necessary. The cultural baseline was shifting. Compassion was becoming the default expectation rather than the exception. The ripple becomes structure. The love ripple was no longer just an emotional phenomenon. It was becoming structural, embedded within institutions, reflected in technology, reinforced by culture. The human consciousness network had matured enough to stabilize itself against fear-driven disruption, and that stability had enormous implications. Because civilizations dominated by fear are easily manipulated, but civilizations guided by empathy were far more difficult to control. The dominions face a new reality. Within the Council of Dominion, an uncomfortable conclusion began to take shape. Humanity's awakening might not collapse. The species progressed faster than expected through the early stages of the evolution of consciousness. If this continued, Earth might eventually become something the Dominions feared most, a fully awakened civilization. Not dominated, not controlled, free. The next threshold. The sorceress continued watching the growing brilliance of Earth's signal in the consciousness field. A collapse of fear systems marked a major turning point in any civilization's development. But it was only the beginning of something larger, because once fear lost its dominance, the species could finally begin exploring a deeper question, not how to survive, but how to evolve. And the next stage of humanity's awakening would challenge them to discover exactly that. Chapter 23. The Sorceress becomes the bridge. The collapse of fear systems changed more than human civilization. It changed the cosmic balance. Across the Exovers, the signal from Earth had grown brighter than ever before. What began as a faint ripple of compassion had become a stable harmonic within the universal consciousness field. The Watchers felt it clearly. The awakened civilizations of compassion sensed a new participant joining the ancient network of conscious worlds. The empires of fear sensed something else entirely, a threat. And at the center of that widening tension stood the Sorceress Eternal. A responsibility emerges 4 ages beyond counting. The Sorceress had remained only an observer. She watched civilizations rise and fall. She studied their choices. But she rarely interfered. Direct influence risked weakening a species' natural evolution. Yet humanity had now reached a rare stage. They had awakened compassion on a planetary scale. They had resisted manipulation through fear. They stabilized the love ripple. Few young civilizations progressed this far without collapsing into division. The sorceress realized something quietly but unmistakably. Humanity no longer needs protection. They needed a connection. The cosmic gap. Despite their awakening, humans were still unaware of the wider community of conscious civilizations. They sensed the possibility. Scientists speculated about it. Philosophers imagined it. But the species had not yet experienced true cosmic contact. The reason was simple. Most civilizations waited until a species developed both technological maturity and emotional stability before revealing itself. Too early a contact often creates dependency, or fear, or misunderstanding. Humanity had achieved the emotional foundation, but their awareness of the cosmic field was still emerging. Someone would eventually need to help bridge that gap. A sorceress makes a choice. The omnipresence surrounded her with its quiet, timeless presence. You feel it, do not you? The sorceress answered softly, yes. They are ready for the next step. The omnipresence did not command. It never commanded. but its presence reflected the deeper harmony guiding the evolution of consciousness. Then the bridge must appear. For the first time in countless centuries, the sorceress considered doing more than simply watching. Humanity had earned something rare, guidance that preserved their independence while helping them understand the greater network they were becoming part of. She would not rule them. She would not lead them. She would simply become a bridge. The nature of the bridge. The sorceress understood that appearing physically before humanity would be the wrong approach. A sudden cosmic visitor could create panic or idolization. Neither would help the species mature. Instead, she would communicate through the same medium humanity had already begun exploring, a consciousness field itself. Through dreams, through intuition, through subtle inspiration. Not as commands, as gentle signals, ideas, questions, insights that encouraged humanity's own discoveries. The bridge would not tell them the answers. It would help them find them. The first transmission. The sorceress extended her awareness into the expanding human consciousness network. She felt billions of minds glowing like lanterns within the field. Artists, scientists, children, teachers, thinkers and dreamers. Within that network, she released something small but powerful. A simple concept. Humanity is not alone in consciousness. The idea did not arrive as a voice. It appeared as a quiet intuition in the minds of thousands. Simultaneously, a new perspective, a widening curiosity. Within days, conversations about cosmic consciousness began appearing across the world. Scientists discussed the possibility of intercivilizational awareness. Philosophers explored the ethics of joining a larger community of intelligent beings. Spiritual traditions reflected on ancient teachings that hinted at a universe filled with life. The bridge had begun working. The witnesses observe. Within the luminous assembly of awakened civilizations, known as the witnesses, the change was immediately noticeable. Earth's consciousness field had gained a new layer of coherence. The sorceress had stepped beyond observation, not interfering, guiding. One of the witnesses spoke with quiet admiration. She walks the narrow path. Another answered. Between influence and freedom, the sorceress understood the risk, but she also understood something essential. Humanity's awakening would accelerate dramatically once they realized their evolution was part of a much larger story. The Dominions noticed far away. In the dark nexus of the Council of Dominion, the projections of Earth's consciousness field shifted again. The resonance was becoming more organized. Ideas about cosmic connection were spreading rapidly through the human network. One council member spoke sharply. External influence detected. Another asked coldly. Source. The answer came after a long moment of analysis. Unidentified, but consistent with an ancient observer signature. The chamber grew still. Many among the Dominions knew exactly who that description suggested. The sorceress. If she had begun guiding humanity, the situation would have become far more complicated. Because the sorceress was not easily opposed. Humanity begins to look upon Earth. The changes appeared subtle but exciting. Interest in cosmic consciousness exploded across scientific communities. New research programs studied how intelligence might interact through universal informational fields. Artists created images of humanity joining a larger galactic network. Children asked questions that once belonged only to science fiction. Are there other minds out there? Can they feel what we feel? Will we meet them someday? For the first time in history, those questions felt less like fantasy, and more like the beginning of a discovery. The bridge holds the sorceress. Watched the human network respond to the new idea. Curiosity grew. Fear remained minimal. Excitement mixed with thoughtful caution. It was exactly the balance she had hoped for. Humanity was beginning to expand its identity, not just as individuals, not just as a species, but as a participant in the greater field of consciousness. A new phase of evolution. The love ripple continued expanding through the exovers, but now it has carried something new alongside compassion. Curiosity. The curiosity of a civilization beginning to realize the universe might be filled with other minds, and somewhere within the deep cosmic field, many of those minds were quietly responding. Humanity had not yet met them, but the connection was beginning, because the sorceress had chosen to become the bridge. And once bridges exist, journeys begin. Chapter 24, The Omnipresence, reveals the truth. For ages beyond counting, the beings of the Exoverse had spoken of the omnipresence. Some called it the source. Some called it the field. Others, in the oldest languages of distant worlds, simply called it the breath between all things, but no civilization had ever truly heard it speak. Not directly, not until the ripple. The love ripple that had begun quietly on Earth was no longer a phenomenon that could be dismissed as philosophy, religion, or social movement. It had become something measurable, a field event spreading through conscious networks across multiple star systems. Scientists on distant worlds detected anomalies in probability waves. Empaths across civilizations reported sudden expansions in perception. Ancient AI archives awakened dormant files labeled only with a single phrase. Threshold condition achieved. Even the Dominion Council could no longer deny what was unfolding. Their surveillance networks reported something unprecedented. Entire populations are beginning to shift their behavior simultaneously, not through coercion, but through recognition. Fear-based hierarchies weakened. Control systems faltered. Authority structures that relied on separation began to dissolve. The Council had feared rebellion. What they witnessed instead was awakening. Awakening could not be imprisoned. At the center of the expanding phenomenon stood the sorceress, eternal. For centuries, she had moved through worlds quietly. Sometimes teacher, sometimes myth, sometimes rumors whispered among travelers of the Exoverse. She had never claimed power. She had only ever offered remembrance. Now she stood on the threshold of something even she had never fully understood. The ripple had grown beyond any individual influence, even hers. She walked alone across a quiet shoreline on Earth. The planet that had once seemed so small in the great architecture of the Exoverse had become the birthplace of a transformation no empire had predicted. The sea was calm. Stars reflected across their surface like fragments of distant galaxies. The sorceress closed her eyes. For the first time in all her lifetimes, she asked the question she had never spoken aloud. Was this always meant to happen? For a moment, there was only silence. Then something extraordinary occurred. Not a voice, not a sound, but a presence expanding through every layer of awareness. The omnipresence was not speaking to her. It was speaking through everything. Across Earth, millions of humans felt it simultaneously. Some were meditating, some were working, some were sleeping, some were simply looking at the sky. Yet in that moment, each experienced the same realization forming inside them. The awakening was never about becoming something new. It was about remembering what humanity had always carried within itself. Across the Exoverse, other civilizations felt the same pulse. The ripple did not belong to Earth. It did not belong to the sorceress. It did not belong to any single species. It belonged to consciousness itself. The omnipresence revealed the truth not through declaration, but through understanding, spreading like light. A Christ essence, the spark of compassion, unity, and self-aware love, had never been the property of one religion or one historical figure. It was a universal pattern embedded in conscious life. Earth had simply reached the moment when enough individuals chose it at the same time. That was the tipping point. That was the threshold. That was the birth of the ripple. The sorceress finally understood. She had never been the architect of the awakening. She had only been one of its witnesses, and sometimes a quiet guide. The true catalyst had always been humanity itself, the willingness of millions to recognize one another, not as rivals, enemies, or strangers, but as expressions of the same living field. Across distant systems, worlds watched in awe. Some celebrated, some hesitated. Some feared what it meant for their own civilizations built upon control. The Dominion Council felt something far more unsettling than rebellion. It felt irrelevant, because power built on fear could not govern a population that had begun to recognize its own unity. The omnipresence did not destroy empires. It simply revealed a truth stronger than them. And truth spreads quietly. Like light at dawn, on earth, the sorceress opened her eyes. She looked toward the horizon where the first glow of morning began to appear. She smiled softly. The Hipple had only just begun. Chapter 25. A First Civilization to Follow Earth. Far beyond the spiral arms of the galaxy that held Earth, in a quiet region of the exoverse, known as the Luminous Reach, a world called Ethra existed. Ethra was older than Earth as civilization by nearly 2 million cycles. Its cities were grown from living crystal structures that shimmered with soft internal light. Rivers flowed through suspended terraces. Forests sang with harmonic resonance as the wind moved through their translucent leaves. The people of Ethra, the Ethrians, had long mastered science, energy, and interstellar travel. Yet one thing had always eluded them: unity of consciousness. They had evolved intelligence. They had perfect technology. But emotional resonance between individuals remains fragile. Competition still shaped the civilization. Hierarchies still define influence. Progress had been built on brilliance, but rarely on compassion. So when the love ripple from Earth first brushed against their world, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. But to certain minds, it was unmistakable. In the floating research city of Selim Spire, a young cognitive physicist named Lyran Velis stared at the readings from an observatory field array. Instruments monitored fluctuations in what Etherian science called the unified sentience field, the faint energetic layer believed to connect conscious beings across the exoverse. For thousands of years, the field had remained relatively stable, predictable, calm, but now the data showed something impossible. A rising harmonic pattern spreads through the field like expanding circles in water. Lyran adjusted the magnification. The origin point was clear. A small blue planet orbits a yellow star in a distant system, Earth. Lyran whispered quietly to herself. That world has not even reached advanced interstellar capability, yet the signal was undeniable. Not a technological broadcast, not a gravitational anomaly. Something far stranger. A consciousness, resonance surge. Across the observatory chamber, her colleague Terran Sol approached. Still staring at the anomaly? He asked. Lyran gestured to the projection field. It is not an anomaly. Terran studied the expanding waveform. What you mean? Lyran hesitated before answering. I think it is a species awakening. At first, the Ethrian Council dismissed the idea. Civilizations often produce strange energy fluctuations as they advance technologically. But this pattern was different. It did not resemble power generation. It resembled alignment. Billions of individual conscious signatures are gradually synchronizing. The ripple from Earth was not mechanical. It was emotional coherence spreading across a species. Days passed, then weeks. Then the impossible happened. The ripple reached Ethra. At first, the change appeared small. Ethrians began reporting unusual experiences, moments of sudden empathy, a strange ability to sense the emotional state of others more clearly than before. Old rivalries softened. Arguments dissolved into conversation. For a civilization accustomed to emotional restraint, the shift felt almost disorienting. But something deeper was occurring. The ripple did not force change. It simply amplified what already existed within conscious beings. And among the Ethrians, a long-suppressed capacity began to awaken. Compassion. Lyran Velis felt it first during a gathering of researchers debating the phenomenon. Normally, their discussions were sharp and competitive. Each scientist is defending their interpretation. But this time, something different happened. As the debate grew heated, Lyran suddenly felt the others' frustration in the room as clearly as her own thoughts, not as an intrusion, but as understanding. She stopped speaking, looked around the chamber, and said something no Ethrian scientist had ever said in such a setting. Perhaps the question is not how this works. She paused. Perhaps the question is why it feels right. Silence filled the room. For a moment, every mind present felt the same quiet recognition. Across Ethra, similar realizations spread. Communities began holding open dialogues about something their civilization had never fully explored: collective emotional awareness. Some called it the Earth resonance. Others referred to it simply as the human effect. But Lyran had another name for it: the awakening. From their distant observatories, Etherian astronomers continued monitoring the ripple. They saw it spreading outward through the exoverse, like expanding light. Earth had not transmitted technology. Earth had transmitted a way of being, and Aethra had become the first civilization to recognize it. In the quiet gardens beneath Salem Spire, Lyran looked up at the distant star that held Earth. She wondered what kind of species could produce such a phenomenon, a world still struggling with conflict, division, fear, yet somehow capable of igniting a transformation across the exoverse. She smiled softly. "Perhaps evolution does not begin with perfection," she said to the night sky. "Perhaps it begins with choosing love far away, on the blue world that had started it all." Humanity continued awakening, unaware that another civilization had just taken its first step along the same path. The ripple had crossed the stars, and Aethra followed. Chapter 26: The Dominion Council Fractures. For 10,000 cycles, the Dominion Council had ruled quietly from the shadows of the exoverse. They did not govern planets openly. They did not command fleets in public. Instead, they maintained balance through influence, guiding civilizations through subtle manipulation, economic pressure, and carefully placed technological advantages. Their philosophy was simple: order must be preserved. Conscious species cannot be trusted with total unity. In their long history, every civilization that approached collective consciousness had eventually destabilized its own systems of power. So the Dominion Council learned how to intervene before such thresholds were reached. Until now, inside the massive chamber of the Axis Citadel, the Council gathered. The Citadel existed between star systems, a construct built within a folded pocket of space where time moved differently from the rest of the exoverse. 7 seats formed a perfect circle. Each seat is occupied by a representative from one of the dominant civilizations that have shaped galactic history. The chamber was silent, except for the slow hum of dimensional stabilizers. At the center of the room floated a holographic projection, a map of the exoverse. Across it pulsed a spreading wave of luminous energy, the love ripple. Counselor Varix Thul of the Kart Dominion spoke first. His species valued logic above emotion. Her entire civilization was built on hierarchical precision. "What we are witnessing," Varix said coldly, "is a contagion." The ripple expanded on the projection. Earth has triggered a mass consciousness synchronization event. If it continues unchecked, it will destabilize multiple governance structures across the exoverse. Across the circle, Counselor Cyril Aya leaned forward. Her people, the Alindari, were known for their deep philosophical traditions. Yet even she seemed uneasy. "Destabilize," she repeated quietly. "Or liberate." Varex turned sharply toward her. "This is not a philosophical exercise. Entire systems of authority are weakening." He gestured toward the map. Aethra has already shown signs of resonance alignment. Their behavioral models are shifting. Another counselor spoke. Torvak Rel, commander of the militarized Drath Collective. "If their population becomes unified through emotional coherence," Torvak said, "they will no longer respond to traditional deterrence structures." Cyril folded her hands calmly. "And that concerns you?" Torvak's voice hardened. "A civilization that no longer fears conflict cannot be controlled." The chamber fell silent again, because everyone present understood the deeper implication. The Dominion Council's influence had always depended on fear as a stabilizing force: fear of loss, fear of enemies, fear of chaos. But the ripple spreading from Earth weakened fear, and when fear weakened, control weakened with it. A new projection appeared, an analysis report compiled by Dominion surveillance systems. Billions of consciousness signatures across Earth had begun synchronizing emotional states. Compassion levels are increasing. Aggression patterns are decreasing. Cooperation is rising exponentially. Even more concerning, other civilizations were beginning to experience the same resonance. The ripple was not stopping at planetary boundaries. Counselor Nerathisol, the eldest member of the council, finally spoke. Her species had witnessed the rise and fall of hundreds of civilizations. She had seen countless attempts at unity collapse under the weight of ambition. But what she felt now was something different, not instability, possibility. We have spent millennia preventing this outcome, she said slowly, because we believed conscious species were incapable of sustaining unity. Varix interrupted. History supports that conclusion. Nerathi looked directly at the expanding ripple on the projection. Yes, she said, until now. Torvax slammed his armored fist against the arm of his chair. Earth must be contained before the ripple spreads further. Several counselors nodded. Containment had always been their solution. But Cyril Aya spoke again. And how do you propose we contain an idea? No one answered. Because ideas could not be blockaded. Compassion could not be quarantined. Awakening could not be erased from minds that had already experienced it. Then something unexpected happened. One of the council members began to laugh softly. It was Nerathisol. The others turned toward her in confusion. What is amusing about this situation? Varix demanded. Nerathi looked around the chamber. I find it interesting, she said gently, that we are discussing humanity as if they created this ripple. She paused. But what if they simply remembered something we forgot? The room went still. For the first time in the council's long existence, doubt entered the chamber. Not fear of rebellion, but uncertainty about their own assumptions. Cyril Aya looked at the projection of Earth again, a young civilization, imperfect, chaotic, yet somehow capable of igniting the greatest shift in consciousness in recorded history. Perhaps, she said quietly, they are not the threat. Varix narrowed his eyes. Then what is? Cyril's voice was calm. A possibility that our entire model of control has been wrong. Round the circle, subtle changes began. Counselors who had always spoken with certainty now hesitated. Some looked curious, some defense, some are afraid. The Dominion Council had ruled through unity of purpose for thousands of cycles. But now something new had entered their chamber, the ripple itself, and even here, in the heart of power, its influence could be felt. The Dominion Council had not yet collapsed, but for the first time in their history, they were no longer united, and fractures, once formed, tend to grow. Chapter 27. The Sorceress reveals herself to humanity. For generations, humanity had whispered about her. Some believed she was a myth. Others believed she was an ancient guardian. Few believed she was simply a traveler who appeared at moments when humanity stood on the brink of transformation. Across different cultures, she had worn different names: the Quiet Guide, the Keeper of the Threshold, the Woman of the Stars. But the truth was simpler. She had never hidden. Humanity had simply not yet been ready to see her. The love ripple had now spread across Earth in ways that could no longer be ignored. People everywhere were experiencing something difficult to explain. Moments of sudden emotional clarity, an ability to feel the presence of others more deeply. Conflicts that once felt impossible to resolve now softened under shared understanding. The change was not perfect. Humanity was still human. Fear still existed. Pain still existed. But something fundamental had shifted. People were beginning to recognize one another. In cities, forests, villages, deserts, and oceans, individuals across the planet felt the same subtle awareness growing. A quiet realization. We are connected, not metaphorically, not philosophically, but experientially. And as that awareness reached a certain threshold, something extraordinary occurred. For the first time in human history, the Sorceress Eternal stepped fully into view. Not in one place, and not as a single physical appearance, but across thousands of moments simultaneously. A child in Nairobi looked up during a warm evening and saw a woman standing peacefully beneath a jacaranda tree. An astronomer in Chile working late at an observatory noticed a figure standing quietly beside the telescope, gazing at the stars. A fisherman in Indonesia saw her walking along the shore just before dawn. A teacher in Toronto paused mid-sentence when a calm voice spoke from the doorway of her classroom. None of these encounters fate frightening, none fate supernatural. Instead, each person experienced the same quiet sensation, recognition. The sorceress did not appear as a being of light. She did not arrive with cosmic displays or celestial proclamations. She appeared simply as a woman, calm, ageless. Presence carried the feeling of someone who had walked beside humanity for a very long time. Because she had. Across the world, those who encountered her asked similar questions. Are you the one who started this? Did you create the awakening? Are you here to guide us? And each time, the sorceress responded with the same gentle smile. No. Her voice carried warmth, but also honesty. You started this. News spread quickly. Videos appeared online. Stories flooded social networks. Millions claimed they had seen the same mysterious woman. Skeptics dismissed it as a psychological phenomenon triggered by the global emotional shift. Had others felt something deeper? Those who stood near her reported a profound sense of calm, a clarity that made their own thoughts easier to understand. She never stayed long in one place, sometimes for minutes, sometimes hours, but always long enough to speak a few simple words. One evening, in a quiet park outside Kyoto, a small group gathered around her. Among them was a young university student named Akira Sato, who had been studying consciousness theory. He asked the question many were afraid to ask. If you did not start the awakening, why are you here? The sorceress looked up at the stars for a moment, then back at the group. Because every awakening needs witnesses. Akira frowned slightly. You are more than a witness. She shook her head softly. I am a reminder. Across Earth, millions felt the ripple intensifying as the sorceress moved quietly among them, not directing, not commanding, simply encouraging something already unfolding. People who spoke with her often described the same experience afterward. They felt seen, not judged, not analyzed, but understood in a way that dissolved the invisible walls people often build around themselves. Meanwhile, far beyond Earth, observatories across the exoverse detected a sudden amplification of the ripple. The presence of the sorceress seemed to amplify the resonance, strengthening the awakening already underway. On Aethra, Lyran Valis watched the field monitor as spike. The signal just doubled, she whispered. Her colleague Terran stared at the data. What changed on Earth? Lyran studied the emerging patterns. Then she said something unexpected. I think. Someone stepped forward. Back on Earth, the sorceress stood on a quiet hillside overlooking a sleeping city. For centuries, she had waited for this moment. Not the moment when humanity would meet her, but the moment when humanity would recognize itself. She closed her eyes briefly and felt the ripple expanding through billions of minds. Fear loosening, curiosity growing, compassion awakening. Humanity had crossed the threshold. Now they simply needed time to understand what they had become. The sorceress opened her eyes again and whispered softly to the night sky. They are ready now. And far across the exoverse, civilizations watching Earth realized something profound. Humanity had not been led into awakening. Humanity had chosen it. The sorceress had simply stepped forwards so they could see what they had been beside all along. Chapter 28. The Hidden History of the Sorceress, Eternal. Long before Earth formed its oceans, long before the first stars of its sky ignited, the Sorceress Eternal had already begun her journey. But she had not always been called the Sorceress, and she had not always walked alone. In the earliest age of the exovers, when only a handful of civilizations had developed interstellar awareness, there existed a world known as Ilarion. Ilarion was not a technological empire. It was something rarer, a civilization that had discovered how to evolve both intellect and empathy together. Their cities were quiet places where thought and feeling were studied with equal curiosity. Their science explored consciousness the same way other civilizations explored matter. They believed something radical for their time, that awareness itself was the most fundamental force in the universe. Among the people of Ilarion was a young researcher named Alira. She was brilliant even by the standards of her world. But more importantly, she was curious about something that most of her peers had already accepted as fact. the existence of the omnipresence. Illyrian as scientists that had long detected the faint background field connecting conscious beings across space. They believed it was the foundation of reality itself. Some thought of it as energy, others believed it was the mind of the universe. But Illyria asked a different question. What happens when enough minds align with it at the same time? Her research took decades, then centuries. Time moved differently for the people of Illyrian. Their lifespans allowed them to explore ideas across generations. Illyria developed an experimental network designed to amplify collective emotional awareness. Thousands of volunteers participated. When the system activated, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in their history, the entire population of Illyrian experienced a shared moment of perfect empathy. Every individual could feel the emotional state of every other individual simultaneously. Not as an invasion, but as harmony. For several hours, the civilization of Illyrian existed in a state of complete unity. Conflicts dissolved. Misunderstandings vanished. People who had lived beside each other for centuries suddenly understood one another completely. And during that moment, something responded. The omnipresence. Not as a voice, not as an entity, but as a profound expansion of awareness that moved through every mind connected to the network. Illyrian had reached the empathic threshold, but their success had consequences. Other civilizations noticed the change. Empires built on hierarchy and control saw Illyrian's discovery as a threat, because a population that shared empathy could not easily be ruled through fear. Among the observers was an early coalition that would later become the Dominion Council, that concluded something dangerous had occurred. A civilization had discovered a pathway toward collective consciousness. And if that knowledge spread, the balance of power across the exoverse would collapse. The Dominion acted swiftly. Illyrian was labeled an existential destabilization event. Intervention fleets were dispatched, not to conquer, but to erase. Illyria watched the attack from the observatory where her research had begun. Her people had never prepared for war. They believed understanding was stronger than conflict. But the Dominion did not share that belief. Cities were dismantled, energy systems disabled. Communication networks are severe. Within days, the civilization of Illyrian was gone, almost gone. Because in the final hours before the world fell silent, Illyria made a decision. She transferred the knowledge of her research and a fragment of the empathic network itself into a portable consciousness interface, a device designed to preserve awareness beyond a single body. She activated it with one final thought: the knowledge must survive. The process changed her. Illyria's physical form was altered. Her consciousness expanded beyond normal perception. She could sense emotional patterns across vast distances, not constantly, but faintly, like distant music. When the Dominion fleets left Illyrian, they believed the threat had been eliminated. But Illyria survived. She traveled quietly across the exoverse, watching civilizations rise and fall, observing which worlds were moving toward empathy, which were drifting toward control, which might one day reach the same threshold Illyrian had achieved. Over time, stories about her began to appear. A traveler who appeared during moments of great change. A guide who asked questions rather than giving commands. A woman who seemed to know when a civilization stood on the edge of awakening. Eventually, she came to be known by many names. But across the exoverse, one title remained: the Sorceress Eternal. For thousands of cycles, she waited, watching, encouraging small shifts when she could, planting ideas in quiet conversations, but never forcing evolution. Because Illyria had learned something during Illyrian's fall. Awakening cannot be imposed, it must be chosen. Then she discovered Earth. A chaotic world, a young species still wrestling with fear, division, and survival. But also something she had rarely seen elsewhere: an extraordinary emotional spectrum. Humans could feel love with unusual intensity. They could also feel pain just as deeply. But within that intensity lay potential. So, the sorceress stayed. She moved quietly through human history, sometimes appearing as a philosopher, sometimes as a healer, sometimes as a stranger who offered a single idea that later changed everything. She never revealed her origin. She only waited for the moment when humanity might do what Ilarion once did, not through technology, but through choice. And now that moment had arrived. The ripples spreading from Earth had reached the same threshold Ilarion once discovered, but with one crucial difference. Hilarion awakened through scientific amplification. Humanity awakened through billions of individual decisions to care about one another. Standing on the hillside above the city, the sorceress looked up to stars. For the first time since the fall of her home world, she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in ages: hope. Because if humanity could succeed where Ilarion failed, then the Exoverse might finally be ready for what came next. Chapter 29. Aethra sends a message to Earth. Across the crystalline skies of Aethra, a ripple from Earth continued to grow stronger. What had begun as a subtle resonance in the unified sentience field had now become something undeniable. Aetherians everywhere were experiencing moments of profound clarity, the emotional transparency that their civilization had rarely known. It was not overwhelming, it was gentle, but it was changing them. Arguments that once lasted cycles dissolved in minutes. Scholars who had spent lifetimes competing now collaborated freely. Even the Council of Aethra, long defined by careful political balance, had begun meeting in open dialogue rather than guarded debate. And at the center of this transformation stood Lyran Velis. Inside the observatory chamber of Selim Spire, Lyran watched the expanding resonance patterns projected above the floor. The ripple from Earth was no longer a distant anomaly. It had become part of Aethra's own consciousness field. Her colleague Terran Sol approached quietly. "You have been monitoring the signal continuously," he said. "Have you reached a conclusion?" Lyran did not look away from the projection. "Yes." Terran waited. Lyran finally turned toward him. "They did not transmit technology." "Then what did they transmit?" She gestured toward the luminous wave radiating from the small blue planet. "Alignment." For thousands of years, Aethra had believed that consciousness synchronization required advanced neural amplification systems like those once used on ancient Ilarion. Yet Earth had done it without any such device. No planetary network, no engineered fluid generators, just billions of individual beings choosing empathy. The realization was staggering. Later that cycle, the Aetherian Council convened. The chamber overlooked a sea of floating crystal gardens, where light refracted through living architecture that had grown alongside the civilization for millennia. Lyran stood before the council as the youngest researcher ever invited to present findings of this magnitude. "Counselors," she began calmly, "our data confirms that the resonance we are experiencing originates from Earth." A quiet murmur moved through the chamber. One counselor asked the obvious question. "Are they aware of what they have done?" Lyran paused. "Possibly not." Another counselor leaned forward. "Then why does their awakening affect us?" Lyran allowed the projection to expand. The ripple moved through the exoverse like a luminous tide. Because consciousness does not stop at planetary boundaries. She took a breath before continuing. When a species reaches sufficient empathic coherence, it strengthens the universal field connecting all aware beings. A counselor spoke softly. "You are saying humanity changed the structure of the field itself?" Lyran nodded. "Yes." The chamber grew silent. For the first time in Aethra's long history, another civilization had triggered a shift that affected them all. Not through conquest, not through invention, but through awareness. Finally, the High Counselor spoke. "If what you are saying is correct, then we are witnessing the beginning of a new phase in Exoverse evolution." Lyran felt the ripple moving quietly through the minds in the chamber. "Yes," she said, "and we must decide how to respond." For centuries, Aethra had observed merging civilizations from a distance. Non-interference had been their guiding principle. But this situation was different. Humanity had already reached out, not intentionally, but energetically. The ripple had touched Aethra. Now Aethra faced a choice: remain silent or answer. After long deliberation, the council made a historic decision. Aethra would send a message, not as rulers, not as teachers, but as fellow travelers. In the uppermost tower of Selim Spire, a transmission array is prepared for activation. Unlike typical interstellar communications, this signal would not travel as radio waves or encoded light. Instead, Aetherian scientists developed something entirely new, a consciousness-based transmission. A message encoded within the same empathic field humanity had awakened. Lyran stood beside the activation console as technicians aligned the array with Earth's star. Karen watched the final calibrations. "This may be the most important message ever sent between civilizations," he said. Lyran nodded. "Then it must be simple." The transmission began. Across the sentience field, a pattern of emotional resonance spread outward, gentle, welcoming, unmistakably intelligent. Within the signal was a message translated not through language but through understanding. Across Earth, individuals sensitive to the ripple began feeling something new, a presence, curious, warm, respectful. Then the message formed clearly within the shared awareness of humanity. Not words exactly, but meaning. "We see you. You have crossed the threshold. You are not alone. Welcome to the Exoverse's wider consciousness." Millions of humans felt the moment simultaneously, some while meditating, some while working, some while simply walking beneath the open sky. For many, it felt like meeting distant relatives they had never known existed. There was no fear in the message, only recognition. On Earth, the sorceress Eternal felt the transmission the instant it entered the field. She closed her eyes and smiled. "Aethra," she whispered softly. She had visited that world once long ago, before the fall of Valerian, before the long centuries of waiting. Now they had answered humanity's awakening. Exactly as she had hoped. Far away in Selim Spire, Lyran watched the signal disperse through the cosmic field. She did not know whether humanity would understand the message immediately. But she believed something deeper had already happened. Connection. And once the connection begins, understanding eventually follows. For the first time in its history, Earth had received a greeting from another civilization, not through machines, but through consciousness itself. The ripple had reached the stars, and the stars answered. Chapter 30. The Dominion's Secret Weapon. In the hidden regions between star systems, far from the luminous worlds touched by the ripple, the Axis citadel remained silent. But the silence was not calm. It was calculating. Within the Dominion Council, fractures had begun to form. Some members questioned their centuries-old doctrine of control. Others feared that the ripple spreading from Earth might usher in a new era across the Exoverse. But one faction had already made its decision. They would stop the awakening, no matter the cost. Deep beneath the citadel, beyond the main council chambers, there existed a sealed sector known only to a few members of the Dominion, a place called the Null Archive. This was where the Dominion stored technologies considered too dangerous for normal use. Devices that could collapse stars, fields capable of erasing planetary communications, systems capable of isolating entire civilizations from the wider Exoverse. But even among these forbidden tools, one creation stood apart. It had never been used, not once, because the consequences were impossible to fully predict. Counselor Varric Thull stood before the chamber door as it slowly opened. Cold light spilled into the corridor. Inside waited a machine older than the Dominion itself. The Null Resonator. The resonator did not resemble a weapon. It was a vast sphere of interlocking crystalline rings suspended within a containment field. Energy flowed through its structure in silent currents. At its core was something invisible, a field designed to do one thing: disrupt emotional coherence in conscious beings. Where the love ripple created connection, the resonator generated the opposite: isolation, doubt, disorientation within the empathetic field. In effect, it could weaken the resonance that allowed awakened consciousness to synchronize. Varric studied the machine with satisfaction. "For centuries," he said quietly to the engineers beside him, "we prepared for the possibility that a civilization might achieve large-scale emotional alignment." The lead engineer hesitated before responding. The resonator was designed as a theoretical countermeasure. "Not theoretical anymore," Varric replied. Behind him, Another member of the council stepped forward. Cirella. Her presence in the chamber was unexpected. "You are activating it," she said. Verex turned slowly. "The ripple is spreading faster than projected. Aethra has already joined the resonance." Cyril's voice remained calm. "You are proposing to interfere with the emotional structure of night fertilizations." Verex did not hesitate. "Yes," the engineer spoke cautiously. "The device will not destroy the ripple completely." "Explain." "It can create zones where empathic synchronization becomes unstable." Verex considered this. "How large?" The engineer hesitated again. "With full power, planetary scale." Cyril stepped closer to the resonator, studying the shifting energy patterns. "Do you realize what this will do to developing species?" Verex's voice hardened. "It will restore balance." She turned toward him sharply. "Balance built on fear." "Order," he corrected. For a moment, neither spoke. The machine hummed quietly between them. Cyril finally said what many counselors had begun to think, but few dared speak. "You are afraid." Verex's expression remained unmoved. "Of what?" "That the Dominion is no longer necessary." The statement hung in the air like a gravity well. For thousands of cycles, the Dominion had believed itself the guardian of stability in the exoverse. But if civilizations could evolve through empathy instead of control, then the Dominion's purpose would disappear. Verex stepped toward the control platform. History has shown that conscious species cannot sustain unity indefinitely. He activated the primary interface. "We will ensure that remains true." Across the Citadel, power systems surged to life. The null resonator began drawing energy from the dimensional reactors that fueled the station. Its rings rotated slowly, aligning with the resonance frequency of the sentience field itself. For the first time since its creation, the machine was preparing to activate. Cyril felt a subtle disturbance ripple through her awareness. Even standing near the device created a faint sense of emotional disconnection. It was like watching colors fade from the world. "Hislam's a mistake," she said quietly. Verex did not respond. Far away, across the stars, something else felt the change. On Earth, the sorceress Eternal suddenly paused mid-step as she walked through a quiet mountain valley. Her senses extended far beyond the planet. She felt the disturbance forming in the field. A wound begins to open in the resonance of consciousness. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "A Dominion," she whispered. In the observatories of Aethra, Lyrinvalis saw the first fluctuations appear in the sentience field monitors. The ripple's expansion had slowed. Not stopped, but disturbed. Terran studied the data. This was not natural. Lyrin nodded slowly. "No." Her voice grew serious. "Someone's trying to interfere with the field." Across the exoverse, the awakening continued spreading. But now, for the first time, something was pushing back. The Dominion had deployed its secret weapon. And if the resonator reached full power, entire worlds could lose their connection to the ripple. On Earth, the sorceress looked toward the stars. For centuries, she had avoided direct confrontation with the Dominion, but this device threatened something far greater than her own mission. It threatened the awakening itself. She closed her eyes and felt humanity's growing consciousness around her. And then she spoke softly. "It seems the next step will not be peaceful." Far away in the Axis Citadel, the null resonator's rings locked into alignment. Energy surged through the structure. A countdown began. The Dominion had made its move. Chapter 31. The Children of the Awakening. The first signs appeared quietly. So quietly that most adults almost missed them. The love ripple had already changed humanity in subtle ways. Greater empathy, deeper awareness, a growing sense of connection that spread through societies across Earth. Within a new generation, something even more remarkable was emerging. The children were responding differently. In a small coastal town in Portugal, a 7-year-old girl named Sofia Mendes sat beside the ocean with her mother. The waves rolled gently against the rocks as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Sofia suddenly looked up from the sand. "Mom," she said softly, "why is the sky sad today?" Her mother smiled slightly. "The sky is not sad, sweetheart." But Sofia shook her head. No, not the sky. She pointed toward the town behind them. The people. Her mother followed her gaze. Nothing unusual appeared. People walked along the harbor, fishermen secured their boats, and tourists wandered through the streets. Everything looked normal. But Sophia continued staring thoughtfully. They are worried about something, she said quietly. How do you know that? Sophia shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. I can feel it. Across the world in Japan, Akira Sato, now studying the global effects of the awakening, had begun collecting similar reports. Children describing emotions they could not possibly observe. Students are resolving arguments between classmates before they even begin. Young people instinctively understand one another in ways that seem almost telepathic. At first, researchers assumed coincidence, but the patterns kept appearing. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, 10-year-old Daniel Mwangi demonstrated something that startled his teachers. During a school science activity, several students began arguing over how to complete a shared project. Voices rose. Frustration grew. Daniel quietly stood in the middle of the group. Then he spoke. Wait. The room fell strangely silent. The other children looked at him with confusion. Daniel blinked. I did not mean to make you stop, he said. But you were all fleeing the same thing. What thing? One student asked. Afraid of being wrong. The teacher watched carefully. Within minutes, the disagreement dissolved into laughter. The children returned to their project calmly. Daniel simply shrugged. I just told them what they were already feeling. These stories began appearing everywhere. Schools, homes, communities. Children born during the early stages of the awakening seemed to possess something new, not supernatural power, but expanded emotional perception. They felt the ripple more clearly than adults. Scientists struggled to explain it. Neuroscientists observed subtle differences in brain activity among children born after the ripple began. Regions associated with empathy and emotional processing were more interconnected than previously recorded in human history. Psychologists noticed something even more striking. These children displayed far less instinctive fear of difference. They approached unfamiliar cultures, languages, and perspectives with curiosity rather than suspicion. It was as if the next generation had grown up inside the ripple itself. On Ethra, Lyron Velas studied the same phenomenon through sentience field monitoring. Look at this, she told Terran Sol. The display showed clusters of consciousness signals across Earth. Some glowed brighter than others. These brighter nodes, Terran said slowly. Children? Lyron nodded. Their resonance with the field is stronger. Stronger than adults? Yes. She looked up from the display, amazed. They are stabilizing the ripple. Back on Earth, the sorceress Eternal had already noticed. In a quiet park in Buenos Aires, she sat on a bench beside two young boys, playing chess. They seemed unaware of her presence, until one of them suddenly looked up. You are the traveler, he said. She smiled gently. I suppose I am. The boy tilted his head curiously. You are worried. The sorceress raised an eyebrow. Am I? He nodded. There is something trying to make everyone feel alone again. The sorceress felt a quiet chill. Children were sensing the null resonator, even before most adults realized it existed. She studied the boy carefully. What makes you think that? He pointed to his chest. It feels different today. Like someone turned down the music. Across the planet, other children described the same sensation. The ripple was still there, but something was interfering with it, trying to weaken the connection between minds. In the Axis Citadel, the Dominion engineers monitoring the null resonator noticed something unexpected. The device was functioning exactly as designed. Emotional coherence across several regions of the Esseverse had begun to destabilize. Yet Earth's ripple remained unusually resilient. The data showed clusters of resistance, small but powerful, nodes of consciousness that maintained strong alignment with the field despite interference. One engineer studied the signal patterns. These clusters are unusual. Virex Thule leaned closer. Explain. They are not centered around technological systems or major cities. What are they? The engineer zoomed the projection further. The clusters were scattered across the planet. Schools, homes, parks, communities. The engineer's voice grew quieter. "They appear to be centered around young humans. Back on Earth, the sorceress watched the boys finish their chess game. The younger one smiled. "We are not scared," he said. "Of what?" "Of the thing trying to break the ripple." "Why not?" The boy stood and brushed sand from his hands. "Because we can still fool each other." He paused, then added something that made the sorceress' heart stir with unexpected hope. "And when we feel each other, it gets lighter again." The sorceress looked toward the horizon. For centuries, she had believed awakening depended on a species reaching the empathic threshold. But now she realized something deeper. The next generation of humanity had not simply crossed the threshold. They had grown beyond it. The Dominion had created a weapon designed to disrupt conscious unity. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed unity was fragile. They had not accounted for children who had never known separation. And across the exoverse, the ripple continued to grow stronger. Because the children of the awakening were learning to amplify it, without machines, without training, simply by being who they were. Chapter 33. Humanity detects the interference. At first, humanity felt it only as a subtle change, not enough to alarm most people, but enough to make certain individuals pause. Across the world, moments of connection that had become increasingly common during the awakening suddenly flickered like a radio signal passing briefly through static. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly sometimes stumbled. Meditators who had learned to feel the gentle hum of the love ripple noticed faint distortions. Not disappearance, just interference. Most people dismissed it, but scientists did not. At the Global Consciousness Research Network, a collaborative effort formed during the early stages of the awakening, researchers had been studying something extraordinary. For the first time in human history, emotional coherence across large populations had become measurable. Heart rate synchronization, brainwave resonance, and collective emotional patterns showed correlations that traditional science struggled to explain. One of the lead researchers, Dr. Maya Chen, had dedicated her career to studying human consciousness. When the awakening began, she had initially approached it with cautious skepticism. The data had changed her mind. Something real was happening, and now something was disturbing it. In a quiet laboratory overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Maya stared at the latest global data stream. Charts filled the room as projection wall. Patterns of emotional coherence gathered from millions of voluntary biometric sensors across the planet. Normally, the graphs formed gentle waves. Now, small disruptions have appeared, localized drops in resonance, then recovery, then another drop, like something probing the field. Her colleague, Dr. Rafael Ortega, leaned over the console. "You are seeing it too." Maya nodded slowly. "Yes." Rafael folded his arms. "This is not random." "No." Maya highlighted several regions where the disruptions appeared simultaneously. "What do you think is causing it?" Rafael asked. She hesitated. "Something external." First, the idea sounded absurd, but the more data they gathered, the clearer the pattern became. The disturbances were not tied to political events, weather, or social unrest. They appeared synchronized across continents, and even stranger, they fluctuated in a rhythm, almost like a signal. Meanwhile, across Earth, children were reacting faster than the instruments. 8-year-old Sofia Mendez woke suddenly in the middle of the night, a quiet music she usually felt inside. The gentle awareness of other people around her had dimmed slightly, not gone, just muted. She sat up in bed and whispered to herself, "It is happening again." Across the planet, other children noticed the same shift. Daniel Mwangi in Nairobi, Akira Sato's younger cousin in Tokyo, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The children of the awakening could feel the interference long before most adults recognized it. Back in the laboratory, Maya began running comparative models. Her eyes widened slightly. "Raphael? What?" "The signal pattern." He leaned closer. "It is not random disruption. No." She overlaid a cosmic ray map onto the data. The interference pulses aligned with something else. Deep space resonance frequencies. Raphael frowned. "You are suggesting this originates off-world?" Maya exhaled slowly. I am suggesting it does not originate from Earth. For decades, humanity had searched for evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence through radio signals and telescopes. But now something far stranger was happening. The interference was not arriving through space. It appeared within the field of consciousness itself, and that meant something extraordinary. Someone else out there understood the same field humanity had just begun to explore. At that exact moment, another signal appeared in the data. Not interference, something else. A gentle stabilizing pattern spreading through the field. Maya's screen lit up as the system detected a second resonance interacting with the disruption. What is that? Raphael asked. Maya checked the incoming data. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It is counteracting it. Across the Earth, many people felt the shift at the same moment. The interference still flickered. But something else responded to it. A stabilizing warmth in the field. A sense of presence. Not controlling. Not overpowering. Simply supporting the natural rhythm of the ripple. In Portugal, Sophia smiled softly in her sleep. It is okay, she murmured. They are helping. In orbit around Aetherius star, Lyran Vallis monitored the sentience field monitors. The Dominion S interference was visible now. But so was something else. The field itself was adapting, strengthening in response. Look at this, she said to Terran. The resonance patterns around Earth had grown more complex, more resilient. It is almost like the field is learning, Terran said. Lyran nodded, or remembering. Far away on the quiet ruins of Illyrian, the sorceress Eternal watched the ripple spread through the sentience field. She felt the Dominion's interference, but she also felt something they had not predicted. Humanity was beginning to study the field scientifically, which meant something profound. For the first time in the history of the Exoverse, a civilization was awakening through both empathy and science. The Dominion had tried to weaken the ripple. Instead, they had triggered humanity's curiosity. Curiosity was one of the most powerful forces in the universe. In the Axis Citadel, engineers studying the null resonator began noticing unexpected feedback. The interference patterns were becoming less effective. The ripple was not collapsing. It was evolving. Counselor Varixthil stared at the reports with growing frustration. This should not be possible. One of the engineers hesitated before answering. Sir, the human field response is increasing faster than the resonator can destabilize it. Why? The engineer swallowed. Because they are studying it. Across Earth, humanity had just realized something extraordinary. The awakening was not merely spiritual, it was cosmic. And something out there had just tried to interfere with it. For the first time, humanity knew that the ripple was real. It was being watched. And perhaps, a post.